presenting Alice Hills, Johanna Nadolsky, Human Shields, Distraction, and Neve Perugini, or Nicola Gordon, as you prefer, The Politics of Human Shielding and the Force of Discrimination.
Well, I was delighted to see that Charlie Dunlap's here because he comes from Duke. I come from the other dog. I come from the one that's actually had a cathedral. That's my only picture, by the way. But the one that's had a cathedral since the 11th century. And I imagine, actually, it's probably had hostage taking, kidnapped for ransom, possibly even human shielding since the 11th century as well. I want to suggest that the use of human shields is an emotive, but actually relatively minor feature in urban operations. So I'm looking at a broader picture. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a political theorist, and there's a good chance that what I say will be taken as overly simplistic. That doesn't bother me too much because I think it may be quite useful to offer some very broad brush reminders of some of the environmental realities, if you like, of the situation, the environment in which we are placing human shielding. So, what I want to do is concentrate on some of the bigger issues, if you like. And I want to make some comments, first of all, over the next 25 minutes about my framing question and my assumptions, or if you want to be fancy, hypotheses, before saying something about the ways in which liberal democracies respond to these kind of issues. And then I'll conclude with some very brief observations. I should say, actually, I think from the start that I've been interested in urban operations in particular, from war fighting to COIN to really squalid, grubby little policing operations, and coups too, for some years. I haven't looked at human shielding as such because, quite honestly, it hasn't played a big part in any of the literature I've looked at. I'm not a specialist on the Middle East. And when looking at literature, for example, in relation to the really significant urban operations, Grozny, etc., it just hasn't really played a part. So what I wanted to do was just look at some of the descriptive activities when I was thinking about, well, what on earth is human shielding? And I think one of the problems is that they are actually just so broad and so descriptive. I mean, those were my first thoughts. Those were some of the instances. And quite what Saddam's 800 at a strategic installation have to do with 4 or 5 Somali children sitting on top of a fighter in 1993, I'm not too sure, unless it's, of course, the intent. Now, the other thing that came out from looking at this brief list was, well, actually, is this term really useful? It's fashionable, forgive me, but I think it is fashionable at the moment in certain circles. Is it really helpful? Who is surprised if Hamas's militants cynically and deliberately carry out attacks that rely on exploitation? Actually, if you think about it as sort of dispassionately as possible, they'd be crazy to do otherwise. And as I say, I don't remember seeing any references to human shielding per se in any of the camps, Grozny, Mogadishu, Fallujah for that matter. I don't remember seeing or hearing any references in any of the RAND conferences in the 90s, where urban operations were explicitly, and I think very successfully, explored. So I think actually at best human shielding is, as a discrete, very specific phenomenon, actually a minor feature. And indeed, if David Kilcullen's assessment of the coming age of the urban guerrilla is correct, then it's going to be even more secondary. Because contemporary terrorists, the sort that he was talking about, particularly in Mumbai, for example, tend not to bother with human shields or hostages. That's actually arguably a reason for their success. Their light weapons gave them tactical advantages, but so did their complete disregard of human life. I mean, don't get me wrong, I accept that it's technically prohibited by international law. So the ICRC, for example, is in no doubt that it's forbidden. We've had that stressed, and the UN isn't either. And in fact, a recent UN report on human rights in Sri Lanka's civil war is very widely viewed, I understand, as a global test of the ability of Western powers to enforce human rights rules, such as anti-human shielding. But in practice, I think like many international concepts of righteous behaviour, human shielding is regularly discarded. The Sri Lankans are very unlikely to allow international judges to act as decision makers rather than observers, and actually they're much happier in very profitably selling their expertise at winning really grubby, dirty wars. I think the term is actually very slippery. And forgive me, this is going to sound really rude to my wonderful hosts, very generous hosts, etc. But I think it's actually meaningless to say that, quote, practically all fighting within a city involves human shields in some form or another. It involves humans too, but does that really help me understand the dynamics? I'm not sure. It may offer insights, it provokes thoughts, it may offer analytical traction, but I'm not sure it's incredibly useful for me from this very broad brush approach about trying to understand urban operations. I think we need something more minimalist, more legal, and that fortunately is obviously one of the advantages of today's seminar. We can actually focus in a little bit and be a bit more rigorous. It may, for example, be that the intent behind the act matters, in which case human shields may be expressive, calculated, instrumental, strategic, opportunist. But that actually in itself presents a problem, because without reliable information, how do we know the intent, and how can we judge some of the imperatives shaping responses in other cultures? It's very difficult. We risk judging the act from its effect, which I think is a potential issue. And to further complicate matters, of course, we've got the June 15 law of war, about which fortunately others are much more expert in discussing, so I'm going to leave that one. I think actually, regardless of these kind of issues, what I would suggest is that when it comes to understanding urban operations, the debate about the utility or the acceptability of human shields is actually a distraction from more fundamental issues. Of these, it strikes me that one of the more significant is whether strikes by conventional militaries can ever, not should, but can ever be targeted to minimize civilian casualties in densely populated areas. I suggest they probably can't, which actually takes me to the question that I want to address here. And this is my sort of overall framing question, if you like. Whether in fact human shielding is reshaping the significance of the urban operation, of the urban space. My answer is that it isn't and it can't probably. Yes, it draws attention to some very significant issues, and yes, Western publics in particular are influenced by graphic imagery, by the sheer theatre of much of what we've been talking about. But I don't think this amounts to reshaping the political, the strategic, or the tactical significance of the urban space. There are more important fundamental factors shaping the very mix that we actually regard as the constituents of urban space. And incidentally, don't forget, the very phrase, the very term, urban space is relatively recent, to the last 10 years or so. Before that, it was other names. And that's actually quite an important comment to throw in, if you like, because my overall assumption, or rather my assessment, is based on three assumptions, which I think have stood the test of time over the last 70 or 80 years, since the heyday of urban operations in the 40s. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, they actually remain remarkably consistent. So my first assumption is that tactical advantage, whether you like it or not, whether it's desirable or not, a short-term tactical advantage always accrues to the unscrupulous. It may be very difficult for those unscrupulous characters to translate this into political or strategic achievement, classic problem in counterinsurgency, but actually, it may not matter. Tactical success so often offers desirable short-term opportunities. And the non-state actors, the adversaries we've been talking about today, whatever you want to call them, the more successful are smart and very maneuverable. They're the rats rather than the dinosaurs, to think of the Chinese approach to some of these issues. And if you add in the sheer messiness of so many contemporary conflicts, you can see that tactical advantage can be exploited. That's what it's all about. Maybe this is actually one of the challenges that liberal democracies confront. My second assumption certainly is, and that's conflict, I would suggest, whether we're talking about counterinsurgency to full-on warfighting. It's always inherently brutal, messy, and asymmetric. mean, this doesn't actually tell us very much, but it's a salutary reminder, particularly when we talk of surgical precision and other nice phrases, and they're less popular now than they were. It became almost expected that somehow there would be a clean surgical approach to urban operations, and I don't think it exists for a variety of reasons. Why be surprised? I think, in fact, the basic dynamics today are remarkably similar to what's gone before. Yes, drones are very useful, they're exciting, innovative technologically, but actually they haven't yet been used in relation to conventional forces, so their applicability may be more limited. A clearer example might be the question of mouse holding. Very popular with Canadian forces in the 40s, who were superb at it, but actually this was 70 odd years before the IDF exploited it under the label of walking through walls. There's actually nothing new about it. The techniques are probably much the same. So what I'm saying is that there are an awful lot of continuities. I mean, God bless Clausewitz. There are, in a way, some eternal verities of these kind of operations. And then thirdly, technological superiority simply isn't sufficient. It's useful, it can be exploited, but it's not sufficient. It can be used to offset the manpower-intensive nature of urban operations, and anybody who didn't use it would be crazy. But if you look at, for example, Jane's Defence Weekly, they're very hot on technology. And it's always about the latest technologies that can be exploited. They're usually very expensive. So in August, for example, it reported that this is Jane's, the head of Australia's modernisation and strategic planning, said that the West should assume that its future adversaries will disrupt its C2 capabilities and thus compete for decision superiority. And that this plus urbanisation, and this is the head of the Australian part of this military talking, the West may very easily lose the initiative. So technology will be sufficient. Much the same reply from the UK's defence staff, the chief of which said in September that it's very important to maintain an advantage in the grey area between fighting wars and preparing for the next. He was actually thinking of robotics, microprocessors, novel materials and so forth, but perhaps he should have also added in strategic innovation, or even plain simple thinking, because that's equally important. And actually by innovation, he didn't even really mean sophisticated battle management systems anyway. In fact, his argument was that supported by the Australians actually, that the relatively simple and relatively inexpensive IDF systems probably worked better, because of the conscript army, than the US's very, very expensive arrangements. In fact, the general argument from both the Australians and the Brits was that the US's biggest battlefield advantage, precision-guided weaponry and so forth, may actually be fading because it's more accessible. It's more easily available to the big, really successful military groups. So I think in the light of these kind of considerations, human shielding doesn't necessarily help us understand the dynamics of operating in urban spaces. Let me just elaborate a few points. Human shielding may be a legal, moral, ethical issue, but actually responding to it operationally, amongst other things, requires technical precision, actionable intelligence and so forth, because otherwise the urban space can't be managed. Perhaps not surprisingly, precision has actually become something of a holy grail. It's key, yes, to distinguish politically, and actually probably morally too for many of those involved, competence from civilians. I can't comment about the legal distinctions because others are better enabled to do that than I am. But it's certainly important to keep collateral damage and civilian casualties to a minimum. Why? 3 simple reasons. Cities are rarely empty. It's very rare that they're evacuated before operations begin. Not even Rosley was evacuated. Secondly, the populace invariably gets in the way. Accidentally or intentionally, it'll get in the way and muddy the system. And then thirdly, there's a strong need for certainly the West or the international community to balance military success, tolerable casualties, and specific norms. So for a whole host of reasons, the urban really matters. This may or may not have increased the fashionability, the use of human shields, and yet it seems unlikely to me. More to the point, it doesn't suggest that the urban space has been reshaped. It might be worth noting in passing, incidentally, that when it comes to warfighting in particular, the urban space is most effectively reshaped by physical force, quite literally. Okay, we may not be quite so keen in the West today on flamethrowers, but novel explosives, anti-aircraft guns, AK-47s, they're what really reshape the urban space. I mean, this is being really naive, I know, but it's important not to forget it, because it's what really messes up bodies for a start, and it's what's most effective. It might be worth noting, too, that the most effective urban fighters or coin operatives in recent decades have actually been the Russians. And Russian forces in Grozny, of course, used rubberization to achieve their ends, to reshape the urban space. I would also suggest that, in a way, we shouldn't look even to novel explosives and so forth as being critical, because let's not forget the low technology. You know, mirrors for looking around corners, flexicups. US Marines going into Baghdad certainly found those very useful. And when it comes to the period just after conflict, then the urban space is most effectively reshaped by good old crime, by entrepreneurialism, by illicit business, if you prefer, by selective security, and by a vocabulary that depends on physical force. Despite this, I would say that actually conceptual issues are important in this context, because from my point of view, they actually help indicate the way in which militaries think, learn, and act, or the way in which they justify their rationality, if you like, for activities. What to say? It's all about exploitation. Reconceptualizing the urban military space became, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, very fashionable, very exciting, and actually very thought-provoking. I remember, up until about the early 90s, it was all about military historians, and then things shifted, and geographers became involved, human geographers, and then anthropologists, and it was wonderful. It was really, really exciting, because they were bringing new perspectives to what had previously been really rather conventional, orthodox, and repetitive explanations of what was going on in this rapidly urbanizing world. People like Steve Graham, for example, began actually attributing this partly to what he called a shadowy military urbanism, which I think is taking conspiracy theories a little bit too far, but it was exciting. At much the same time, Israel's Operational Theory Research Institute began work. And at times, some of the work in that became a little bit like a sub-branch of metaphysics, with lots of references to Deleuze's smooth and striated space, form as rival entities, and so on. But again, on other occasions, some of the topics of conversation, velocity versus rhythms, was thought-provoking. It was great. It was showing the importance of thinking about these matters, of conceptual issues. In the 2000s, the Israeli military were notable for seeking to reconceptualize the urban space, not in response to theoretical issues so much, but as a very practical way of penetrating refugee camps. And that again actually took the broader dynamics, the imperative shaping urban operations out of the very specific case geographical context into something a little bit broader. In fact, there was lots of talk about developing urban syntax. And although this is perhaps a little bit descriptive, even thinking about these matters as a syntax or as a grammar actually helps, I think, because previously it wasn't done. And it's thought-provoking again. So we have lots of new issues addressed. Where we stand now, I'm honestly not really sure. I think urban operations have slipped down the West political agenda to be replaced, obviously, by the security-related challenges of terrorism, previously counterinsurgency and so forth, and I'm pretty certain in a few years' time will have shifted on to something else. It rephrases the debate, it introduces a new literature to engage with, and all those other rather academic terms. And also, certainly when it comes to urban operations, there's always been a strong suspicion, particularly on the part of a number of practitioners, that actually operations in the urban space are merely a subset of tactics anyway. I certainly found that when talking to a number of senior UK officers in the late 90s. They didn't think it was important enough to actually address it as a specific issue. So there are issues. What these add up to, I think, is the fact that human shielding has, if it's ever going to, not yet reshaped the urban space in which militaries, and I would suggest police and others, operate. There's a lot of academic chatter about issues such as humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, but I don't think yet, though this may change, due to your work it might, I don't think yet that human shielding's produced concepts akin to those developed by the OTRI, and I don't think yet it's produced the intellectual ferment associated with counterinsurgency. It may not. Be exciting if it did, but I'm not sure. This suggests to me that actually while urban operations present many challenges for liberal democracies, shielding isn't necessarily one of them. So what are the kind of problems that special problems it presents? Does it present a special problem in the first place? Well, yes and no. A number of tensions are identifiable, and most critical is how to balance minimal own casualties and low collateral damage with operational effectiveness. It's true that Western forces are constrained, in theory and quite often in practice, by international humanitarian law. It's equally clear that that's what lawyers are employed to deal with. It sounds a bit cynical, but actually, how can we think otherwise? And it's not just the US and its allies during the 2000s, actually. I think back to Mogadishu in 1993 when a UN helicopter opened fire on a crowd, killing 60-odd plus at least. And the UN spokesman at the time said, quote, "There are no sidelines or spectator seats. The people on the ground are considered competent." I mean, more generally, I think distinguishing fighters from populace more broadly is just such a continuous theme in every single operation, in every single decade, certainly since the 40s and long before. Problem for the Russians, think back to Algiers, Battle of Algiers, big problem there. Think to the problems that US forces faced while they're operating roadblocks in Iraq. How do you distinguish? Very, very difficult. So, what I think Western governments need to do is take the moral high ground, but the legal and moral framework of coalition operations have yet to be reconciled with the realities of urban war, and actually urban operations more generally. Dealing with this is likely to be as sharply divisive in the future as it is at the moment and as it's been in the past. Even so, I think it's misleading to assume that a liberal way of war precludes the use of human shields. First, because of the problems, the overlapping nature of distinctions, which has been flagged up today. And secondly, war is, as ever, about deception. The niceties, the borders and so on may be complicated, but as the Deputy Commander of the IDF's tunnel training company said recently, by way of deception thou shalt do war. So, building on this interpretation, 4 general points, I think, about urban operations in particular are worth noting. I think they do, first of all, have their own logical grammar, and it's not a very nice one. I've said a lot about that, but they're brutal, they're squalid, they're destructive, they're expensive, they're technically challenging. Everything, all the challenges of military operations are magnified in the urban environment. Technological developments, innovative doctrine, actually arguably account for less than training and experience. You know, it's the NCO's war and so forth. Secondly, human shielding doesn't, or what it represents, doesn't challenge the Western way of war as such, but urban operations undoubtedly challenge its preferences. So there are problems there. On the other hand, don't forget that Dresden, Coventry, Tokyo, 70 years ago or so? Not that long. You know, think more broadly. I don't know if we have any historians in the room, but historians can bring a much broader and I think very valuable perspective to these kind of matters. What else? Under this second point, operations can't, it appears, be made simultaneously military effective, efficient and casualty free, least of all in cities. And operational effectiveness has to remain the critical element. I don't actually think that minimising non-combatant casualties is a useful operational objective, though it's something that liberal democracies clearly have to hold to and be shown to hold to. But, as I said earlier, generally speaking, tactical advantage, unfortunately, belongs to the less scrupulous. Strategic coherence is necessary, yes, where that implies that we need to fit our discussions about human shielding and what human shields represent into a strategic framework, but otherwise it won't be as influential as I suspect most of us in this room would like. And then fourthly, and I stress this, technology alone can't ensure success. There are issues here. Yes, it offers promising ways of achieving innovative tactics and possibly also innovative thinking, but it won't achieve success on its own, not politically, not strategically or operationally for that matter. And let's face it, the West's technological superiority can facilitate success, but it can't ensure it because enemies need only to avoid defeat. So, some brief concluding observations. Human shielding, I would suggest, is not a ubiquitous phenomenon, and it hasn't as yet reshaped the significance of the urban space. Not for the US, not for the UK, let alone for France, China, Russia, India, Syria, Nigeria. Where do I draw the line? Singapore? I doubt it. War fighting, tsunamis and major industrial accidents like hazardous chemical disasters like the one in the Chinese port of Tianjin. They dislocate urban life, but I don't think human shielding is doing the same way. What human shielding does is allude to long understood and long known challenges such as precision targeting and the overlapping that exists between competence and non-competence. But there's nothing new about this. Nothing new about Western regimes insisting on the legality of their actions in order to rationalise the violence deployed. This is what lawyers are paid for. It's what actually, and I'm not getting out of honest, but I think...
Yeah, you have a point.
I must finish my time, so I got just off. I think in conclusion, urban warfare is typically brutal, it's destructive and it's irregular, but actually, if, to quote the programme, practically all fighting within a city involves human shields in some form or another, then we need to find another term. And preferably, personal plea, a slightly more elegant one than human shielding. Thank you.
I'm going to show some movies, so if people want to sit.
I want to give you some two pages of the map.
It's 5 years. So, in many ways, this paper is a direct continuation of our book, The Human Right to Dominate, which focused on the deployment of human rights as a tool of domination in Israel-Palestine. In this project, we examine the history of human shielding, a rapidly growing phenomenon related to the increasing weaponization of human bodies in contemporary warfare. We're particularly interested in the history and politics of human shielding. A shield literally denotes an object of variable dimensions and shapes, which is used as an instrument of protection. As a basic military concept, the word shield refers to a universal and cross-cultural instrument utilized in different contexts in order to provide defense and preserve the human body from being injured. On the one hand, then, a shield is a protective tool, one that reminds us that human beings, even the most capable and brave, always remain vulnerable subjects who can be injured or killed. On the other hand, since almost every offensive is dependent on some sort of protection, the shield also functions as a necessary instrument of combat, making it easier for its possessor to injure or kill the enemy. The shield, in other words, serves as a physical and conceptual threshold. It epitomizes the dialectic between armed offense and defense within the framework of violence and war. The issue becomes even more complex when the adjective human is tied to the word shield, forming the phrase human shield. Generally speaking, this phrase refers to situations in which civilian bodies acquire a protective function in the midst of fighting. Willingly or unwillingly, these bodies are transformed into a technology of warfare, and like inanimate shields, they embody a dialectic between offense and defense. But in spite of the similarities between inanimate and animate shields, three crucial distinctions need to be stressed in order to understand the specificity of human shielding. First, unlike the inanimate shield, the human shield is predicated upon a value that is ascribed to a civilian according to international humanitarian law. Put differently, the materiality of the human body does not really lend itself to shielding, and therefore if the human was conceived to be a mere inanimate object lacking value assigned to the human qua civilian, it would not be useful as a shield. A human body thus becomes a shield by virtue of its definition as a civilian. Second, as opposed to the inanimate shield, which aspires to be invincible in order to protect human vulnerability in war, in the case of human shields, vulnerability itself becomes the means of protection. In other words, the human shield defends a vulnerable body, an object, or an area that has become part of the military hostilities, but it does so through its own vulnerability. In this sense, the politics of human shielding is fundamentally a politics of vulnerability, a form of politics in which vulnerability occupies a central position in the definition of the relationship between political actors within the battlefield and the meaning of violence. The third distinction results from the first two and concerns the ethics of human shielding. Unlike inanimate shields, the appearance of both voluntary and involuntary human shields in a war zone produces a certain ethical uncertainty or ambiguity in the laws of war. When a person in the battlefield is defined as a human shield, a vulnerable civilian body that willingly or not becomes a technology of war whose function is to render a military target immune, he or she loses some of the protections assigned to civilians by IHL, and an ethical quandary surfaces relating to the precise legal status of the human shield. Questions concerning circumstances allowing human shields to be legitimately killed, the way the spaces they occupy are signified, as well as who is responsible for the life and potential death of the human shield, constitute the basic grammar of the ethics of human shielding. What I would like to do here is to focus on the ethical question by examining the principle of discrimination, arguably the bedrock of international humanitarian law, in order to analyze the relationship among visibility, violence, and ethics during war. According to IHL, international law, one of the foundations of the legality of killing in situation of war is the possibility of discriminating between combatants and non-combatants. Indeed, a close relationship exists between legitimate killing and discrimination, between the use of lethal force and the effort to demonstrate the violence adherence to the legal principle of discrimination. Condition of possibility of the principle of discrimination is visibility, the ability to perceive a plurality of actors, to define the relationship among them, and make distinctions. That is why when violence becomes the object of public and legal scrutiny, we often witness a legal visual debate about the perceptions of violence and the degree of discrimination adopted by the actors in the battlefield. Visibility in war itself is a tricky business. Usually when we think of the principle of discrimination and the ability to distinguish between two kinds of actors, we think of the differences between combatants and civilians. The major claim over the years is that often combatants do not wear military uniform, thus rendering it difficult to distinguish them from civilians, particularly in urban warfare where the two kinds of actors constantly intermingle. But as the recently published drone papers make adamantly clear, in recent years, visibility is frequently limited to metadata, namely to interpretation of electronic signals of various kinds. The combatant becomes visible not through the identification of a face, nor even the possession of arms, but through the analysis of metadata. Indeed, drones often target SIM cards rather than people. Accordingly, the distinction between a militant and civilian is often determined by electronic signals and an algorithm of phone calls. This algorithm ultimately produces the military geolocation watch list. So this is kind of a certain kind of discrimination of visibility. We accordingly witness that there's, or maybe to go back to the example that Nicola gave in the introduction, if Jack and Jane are considered terrorists and they frequently call me, the algorithm might suggest that I should be on the watch list as well. We accordingly witness that discrimination has increasingly become subjected to a series of computational mechanisms which are supposedly designed to produce clarity in the midst of war. The geolocation watch list is actually a depiction of targets. These are actually people that are targeted by the drones. But we can readily think of depicting human shields also as metadata, as in SIM cards that are situated in the vicinity of the targeted SIM cards, but have not had any electronic interaction with the targets, or have had interaction of certain kind that behaves differently than the algorithm we understand as defining a terrorist. Hence, the legal visual operation of discrimination does not merely denote the ability to perceive events in a visual manner and identify a specific person on a screen, but as I show below, is dependent on a whole apparatus of discrimination whose findings, classifications, and inferences are constantly subjected to a legal framework of interpretation. Just as importantly, this legal visual computational operation is not only used prior to an attack in order to determine legitimate targets, which can then be hunted down by the security forces, but is also essential for shaping broader ethical claims after the attack about the moral configuration of the battlefield. Those who have used lethal force in their efforts or lack thereof to distinguish between combatants and civilians. In order to investigate the relationship between visibility and discrimination, let's begin by looking briefly at 4 images of civilians taken respectively from Jerusalem and Gaza and from Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula and eastern Ghouta region in Syria. These pictures portray civilians in 4 different contexts, all in proximity of fighting. Obviously, without knowing the details about the context in which these pictures were taken, it is difficult to decipher what exactly we are seeing. The pictures appeared on news websites, and according to the accompanying captions of the images, 3 of the images depict human shields. One interesting question is which pictures depict human shields? As you can see, it is not obvious. Another question has to do with the positionality of the force of discrimination, namely, according to who are these people human shields? Are they human shields in their own eyes, or are they human shields according to the military forces targeting the area? Adriana Cavarero raises the question of positionality in her book, Horrorism, where she underscores how the relationships of violence in the battlefield are frequently perceived from the position of the strong. Human shielding, we maintain, is no exception. What does international law tell us about human shields? So for those of you who are not international humanitarian lawyers, IHL prohibits the use of human shields and states that the presence or movement of the civilian population or individual civilians shall not be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operations, in particular in attempts to shield military objectives from attacks or to shield, favor, or impede military operations. So international law, in other words, does two things. On the one hand, it prohibits the transformation of civilians into human shields, while on the other hand, it allows military forces to attack targets that are protected by human shields, provided they abide by the principle of proportionality. Thus, international law combines the prohibition of using human shields with the legalization of killing them. Consequently, it becomes vital for those deploying lethal force to be able to claim that they can distinguish between a human shield and a person who is simply a civilian. Since in the case of human shielding, the test of excessive injury to civilians can be relaxed, meaning that the principle of proportionality works differently when civilians are framed as shields. Human shielding, in other words, should be understood as a particular articulation of the principle of discrimination, whereby the elusive category of civilianhood is transformed through an act of framing which confers on certain civilians a new legal status. As these four pictures suggest, the distinction among civilians, human shields, and combatants are not self-evident. Distinctions can be performed only by carrying out specific epistemic operations. One crucial operation consists of reframing images and expanding the scope of the visible in order to make out a series of relations. The relations of the people to the architectural structures and other human subjects within and outside the picture's frame. The movement and actions of the people in the frame and of those around them, etc. In order to conform with the law, those who kill human shields have to frame those accused of shielding in some kind of relation to the military targets they presumably protect. Accordingly, we need to understand discrimination as a complex apparatus in which a variety of institutions and actors, such as government and security agencies, think tanks, NGOs, media outlets, which employ legal and security experts, lobbyists, data and metadata analysts, computer scientists, film directors, editors, producers, graphic designers, animation artists, copywriters, all put to use heterogeneous technologies such as satellite images, lasers, GPS, GIS, aerial photos and videos, acoustic vector systems, all this in order to frame lethal violence in ways that often legitimates it. Following Foucault's notion of dispositif, we understand the apparatus of discrimination, a force that shapes, frames, and thus gives meaning to the relationship among actors within the battlefield. Our claim, then, is that the legality or illegality of an attack is construed through a variety of mechanisms, including the images and data associated with the attack, the relationships traced between the image's visible elements or the different electronic signals, the way those responsible for killing interpret these images and signals, and the meaning the viewer ascribes to them. Discussing frames in times of war, Judith Butler reminds us that the frames through which we apprehend, or indeed fail to apprehend, the lives of others are themselves operation of power. They do not unilaterally decide the condition of appearance, but their aim is nevertheless to delimit the sphere of appearance itself. Hence, discrimination is a constituting force that constructs an event while simultaneously circumscribing it. It is dependent on visibility, but visibility itself is always framed, and since the act of framing helps determine the meanings of what we see through the faculty of discrimination, it is vital to interrogate the frame itself, how it is constructed, what emphasizes and elides, and in our case, the rules it composes and applies to enable or disable the discrimination between a civilian and a human shield. In what follows then, I examine the 2014 Gaza war to analyze how civilians are transformed into human shields through the creation and circulation of images in a contemporary context of urban warfare. I do so briefly by examining how the apparatus of discrimination operated in two different sites. I'll probably do only one site here today. The first site is short military video clips circulated by the IDF. The second one is infographics spread by the IDF on its social media. Israel's 2014 attack on Gaza provides a clear example of how violence, visibility, framing, and discrimination intertwine in war. According to data gathered by the UN, over 2,100 Palestinians were killed during Israel's military campaign, Protective Edge in Gaza. Of these, almost 1,500 are believed to be civilians. On the Israeli side, 72 people were killed during the war, 67 combatants, and 5 civilians. The figures already point to a clear discrepancy with respect to the number and proportion of civilian deaths. 70% of all those killed by Israel were civilians, compared to 7.5% of civilians killed by Palestinians. The figures highlight that precision, pinpoint strikes, and surgical capabilities can neither predict nor guarantee discrimination. Indeed, this is not unique to Israel. As the drone papers confirmed, US targeting is accompanied by significant collateral damage. Between 6 and 9 people for every 10 people killed were not targeted. So it's more or less the same ratio of 70–80%. These unintended targets are then legally reclassified and renamed EKIA, enemies killed in action. They become targets after the fact. It is precisely within this context, whereby the enemy is constituted as a legitimate target of lethal violence after the fact, that we need to understand the prominent place of the legal phrase human shield assumed during and after the hostilities in Gaza. The videos disseminated by the IDF highlight the visual and discursive premises on which the human shielding argument was constructed during Operation Protective Edge. They utilize a complex visual grammar that transforms discrimination into a force that plays a major role within the semiotic warfare between Israel and Palestine. As we show, fighting in Gaza is represented through an array of imaging techniques that are disseminated through social media and news broadcasts. And together these images shape the views of different audiences about the meaning of the violence deployed during a military campaign. The first video, How Does the IDF Minimize Harm to Palestinian Civilians in Gaza, was actually released by the IDF Film Unit, a central actor within the apparatus of discrimination, during the 2012 Operation Pillar of Cloud, when the IDF began using social media more extensively to frame its military operations. Let's watch it.
Despite the fact that Hamas operates from civilian areas, the IDF has consistently taken measures to minimize casualties to innocent bystanders by placing phone calls, recorded warnings, and leaflets, all intended to alert civilian bystanders, deploying weapon systems which enable pinpoint accuracy in order to minimize collateral damage, delaying ground and aerial strikes in populated areas, or even canceling them altogether whenever collateral damage to civilians is likely. For more information, click the link below.
Here, the visual ethical capacity to discriminate is claimed through the composition of a very sterile setting, similar to the television advertisement selling a new medicine that claims to attack the bad germs without harming the good bacteria. The medical-like visual framing is accompanied by an authoritative voice that repeatedly tells the viewers that the IDF has consistently taken measures to minimize casualties to innocent bystanders. Israel abides by the principle of discrimination through the use of a series of early warning technologies and weapon system with pinpoint accuracy, while it cancels operation when the chance of collateral damage is too high. This video is as much about framing violence as it is about concealing it, both by using sanitized language to describe lethal operations that killed civilians and by censoring the audience from actually seeing images from the war front. Lethal force is rendered invisible. The second video was released by the Army during the latest the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, 2 weeks after the beginning of the campaign, when an international outcry against the military operation emerged as a result of the rise of Palestinian casualties. Let's watch it.
This is 2014.
Yes, this is week 2.
Targets in Gaza. The IDF collects intelligence through a variety of advanced means. The goal is to identify sites used by terrorist organizations in the Gaza Strip and to anticipate the circumstances that may limit the IDF when targeting these sites. Terrorists operate near civilians from within a changing urban setting. The IDF constantly updates its intelligence, including through the analysis of the Flying Camel Squadron and aerial reconnaissance pilot, who fly over the region on a regular basis. The information collected is passed on to a center tasked with managing the forces in the area and overseeing an operational plan to target terror sites. Legal advisors from the IDF are also involved. They advise the Army of the targeting process and help commanders understand their legal obligations under international law. The Liaison and Coordination Administration can also play a significant role in the process. When feasible, the administration collects information regarding the conditions in Gaza by liaising with international organizations. It also compiles reports of where people are grouping together and where humanitarian activity is taking place. This information then influences whether or how the attack is carried out. The IDF's meticulous research determines the type of terror targets, conditions in the area, and the proximity of targets to the population and civilian buildings. Its purpose is to ensure that strikes on terror targets are as accurate as possible, while reducing unavoidable damage. The Israel Air Force calculates the impact of the explosion based on the type and weight of explosive materials and other factors. These calculations increase the precision of the strike and reduce collateral damage. Upon receiving this information, the IDF forms an operational plan to target terror sites in Gaza. In some cases, a plan may change at the last minute because of developments in the IDF's intelligence analysis. Terrorist organizations fire indiscriminately at Israeli civilians. The IDF combats terror in a precise and effective fashion, making every effort to minimize civilian casualties.
The video depicts the IDF's laboratory of discrimination. The viewers are introduced to the apparatus of discrimination and are shown how an array of experts from different branches of the military and security services deploy various systems of knowledge while utilizing numerous forms of imaging and surveillance in order to map and frame the battlefield. They develop different algorithms and calculations to guarantee accurate targeting and ensure precision. This apparatus has a dual function. It is used to direct the deployment of violence during the fighting and to interpret the meaning of violence post hoc, so as to claim that violence was utilized in accordance with international law and is consequently ethical. The video thus epitomizes the increasingly close relationship between lethal force and the force of discrimination, between the force of military violence and the forces that frames that violence in order to legitimize it. In this video, we notice that the act of transforming civilian into human shields can be used to extend the radius of killability, which is in compliance with the law, but also that the rhetorical technological production of human shields can be used to obstruct the deployment of violence, as in calling off an attack because the target was surrounded by human shields. I'll show one more video and conclude. This is a short video and it doesn't have a voice, you just see pictures. And it's actually part of the previous video.
Why is this in English?
Well,
Why is it in
Hospital.
English?
we'll discuss
About
that.
the hospital.
Okay, so that's more or less it. In this last video, the IDF film unit represents human shielding as a product of the force of discrimination. In this video, human shielding is framed as the embodiment of a dialectical relation between discrimination and indiscrimination. The force of discrimination manifests itself in this instance through the act of tapping. There's an apartment building in Gaza with many Palestinian civilians in it. The moment it is tapped by a small bomb, a warning technology that does not kill, anyone who stays in the building is transformed into a human shield, since the tapping classifies the apartment building as a military target. Those civilians who stay in the building or climb on the roof are framed as resisting the IDF's effort to discriminate. By so doing, they actively undermine the threshold between civilians and human shields. They are the ones who produce indiscrimination. The logic is straightforward. The IDF discriminates by tapping the rooftop so as to designate a military target, and the Palestinians undo the discrimination by leaving the building. The apparatus of discrimination allows the powerful to manipulate the very boundaries of the category itself. Framing forges the boundaries of discrimination. In this instance, the force of discrimination accomplishes several objectives. One, the tapping transforms those who are remaining in the building into human shields. Two, the video frames them as unwilling to abide by the rules of discrimination. Three, it thus produces an ethical asymmetry between actors who can and cannot discriminate. And as a corollary, four, it produces the legitimization for the use of lethal force against civilians who have been framed as human shields. So I'm run out of time, so I'm going to just stop. I have a few more pages, but basically, we think that the politics of human shieldings we have analyzed reveals the relationship between the apparatus of discrimination and the clauses of international law concerning human shields. We could say that the dialectic between visibility and invisibility produced by the apparatus of discrimination constitutes the visual translation of the normative conception of human shields in international law. In fact, on the one hand, according to international law, the shield, be it a human shield or a civilian infrastructure like the hospital in Quds, conceals something, making it invisible in order to impede military operations. On the other hand, it is only by showing and claiming that the human shield is concealing a military target that civilians become visible and targetable as shields. Without this visual normative dialectic and the peculiar ethical role the force of discrimination plays within it, it would be hard to frame the pictures and videos we have shown as cases of human shielding and to legitimize the killing of civilians in Gaza. Thank you. Since it's both Nicola and my paper in the Q&A, maybe Nicola will answer. Why don't you come up here? Yes.
Let's
very, very interesting. I heard what you said about technology, and I tend to agree with you in the urban setting. But what do you think about the development, the hot thing in military circuits now is development of micro drones with facial recognition software, specifically for to hunt specific individuals in the urban environment? And do you think that the international law, as some have suggested, that prohibits the development of chemical and other non-lethals and low lethals is inhibiting the ability to conduct operations in the urban environment in a way that minimizes the threat to civilians? And Neve, let me just ask you a general question. Do you believe that from whatever it was that The Intercept published, that you have a good understanding of how targeting with drones works? In other words, do you equate a watch list with a target list? Is that your understanding? And if so, does your theory depend upon that interpretation of what intelligence is used for targeting of drones? And I'm not sure I understand the relationship of drone targeting with our discussion of human shields. So if you could explicate that one for
me. Both very interesting papers. Neve, I was wondering, just because part of it, because part of your argument is about the way in which the Israeli government produces propaganda material in order to counteract the kind of critiques that would emerge. The kind of videos that were produced for this purpose after 2014 are very much depicting a kind of synchronic notion, like, look, a warning and then a bombing, which completely disregards the fact that all of Gaza was being massively bombed simultaneously. So it also, erases the notion of, a place, a safe place for people to escape. It's as if, the propaganda video simply suggests run away and you will be safe. I'm just wondering if you would capture some of that kind of empirical fact of the multiple bombings going on at the same time as a way of also part of your critique of this. And Alice, I thought your paper is extremely interesting. I think though that I'm curious to know if Nicola and Neve would, in a sense, rebut your central contention that there's nothing particularly distinctive about human shielding, only in the sense that I think some of the developments in urban warfare, and more particularly the rhetoric around the interpretations of IHL that are very recent, are in fact distinctive, to which human shielding is, sort of like a trope that's been, sort of peddled in new ways.
Let's see.
Thank you. I'm a little unsettled and sobered by the very different points of view from which this question of human shielding is being thought about in one sense, from how to make war more ethical, how to make war have less civilian casualties. The other, can one think of thinking about practices of war to have a radical anti-war position? So whether it's about ameliorating conditions of war or to think about how one might think about practices of war from an anti-war position. And here I was thinking about a distinction between whether international humanitarian law, I am not as familiar with it as many of the US, but just to makes a distinction between war and war on terror, and whether war and humanitarian laws governing war and laws governing war and terror in fact produce some of our anxieties, contradictions, and a way of thinking about the body of a civilian. And when I think about the distinction between war and terror, what I'm thinking about is, of course, colonialism, and maybe that's because that's what I work on myself, because terrorism or countering terrorism was the way in which war was conducted in the colonies. So the war on terror, one could say, has profound antecedents in colonial practices, particularly in the context of armed anti-colonial struggles. And so whether one can recuperate the rural into consideration of human shielding, what that might do, especially since you brought in comparison of drones and the casualties of drones alongside those of the bombing or the war in Gaza. Because when you recuperate the rural, I wonder what happens with this earlier triangulation that was being discussed this morning with law, war, and politics, which is that some of these rural landscapes, and I'm particularly thinking of like Waziristan and Indo-Pan borderlands, which were always treated as cases of exception because of a certain kind of anthropological understanding of the rural that was involved in these cases, such that village houses were routinely and continue to be. I mean, if you look at history of Jordan Tabs, right? It's like these guys are in their villages, and therefore the village home itself is, and it has a very long history of always treating the villages as fortresses, and therefore legitimate targets of colonial bombing and now state warfare. So what does it do to bring the rural back in? What kinds of anthropological understandings of the rural and the urban might be at work in thinking about how to use productively, and I think very importantly, this question.
So maybe we start with this first three questions and then we continue with the second round. Chase, Joanne, and panel for the second round.
Quick comments, because I don't know enough about drones to make a reasonable comment, actually. All I know is that any technology that's been developed is very unlikely to be forgotten. It's more likely to be progressed and exploited to its maximum. So I can see them being used in ways that perhaps we can't think of at the moment, but I can't really go beyond that. I should say, by the way, just as a quick throwaway comment, if I stress the word lawyer quite often, it's because lawyers are significant in this world. Academics aren't. Academics' papers are only used when they can be used by militaries to make a particular point, a political point, or some kind of internal politics point. So I think lawyers are actually very, very critical players in this. Lisa, recent changes. I think two quick comments would be, has it changed or can it change the fundamentals? I'm not sure. And the other question would be, really big changes for whom? I can see it changing the rules, if you like, procedures for certain UK, US, Australia, or whatever. Other parts of the global south, I'm less sure. I know that sounds like an easy way out, but I genuinely wonder, because particularly given that mimicry is so important, assuming countries do sign up, mimicry is still a very strong response, I think. So again, I'm not sure it actually changes the fundamentals for me. It's more an expression of reflection.
I want to relate to your first question to Alice in a different way, and then to your second question. Your first question, what it raises is basically that the whole apparatus of discrimination that we're describing is slowly being transferred to robots.
I'm sorry.
To robots. The apparatus of discrimination, this facial recognition, all these signals and the algorithms, and where we're going, if I'm thinking 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're thinking of killer robots that they do their own discrimination according to certain algorithms that we gave. And that's, I think, we're beginning to see that in this apparatus. So that was a bit related to. The second question, I'll begin by turning it on its head and saying, Charlie, How does the U.S. decide to kill someone?
Actually, Neve is, what he's saying is very fair. What he's saying is very fair. Because I think part of the problem is a lack of transparency as to how to do it. Now, from how it's actually done, the flip side of that is the more transparency you have, the more the enemy can work against it. But what Neve is saying is a very legitimate criticism, because if all you have is what you get from the intercept, then you're going to draw certain conclusions. Like when you're first saying, targeted based on a chip in your phone, I'm thinking, gosh, do people really think that? Then I'm thinking, yeah, they do, because that's the only information that they may have. And so I think
But
that
it is,
well, this is
but,
not
but,
unusual.
but what?
And the
I mean, I don't know much about the U.S. military. I know a bit more about the Israeli military, and I assume that the difference is not that big. And I have done interviews about the target banks in Israel. So yes, it is much more complex in terms of gathering of information. But the target ultimately that the drone hitches on is often based on some kind of electronic signal. How that electronic signal was chosen, or the person carrying that electronic signal, is a much more complex idea of different kinds of relations, but they are also slowly being, I would say, quantified so that certain algorithms can be made out of them, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's relationships to different people, and so forth, to make it possible for a robot to do it.
Well, the whole issue of autonomous weapon systems is a little bit separate, and we have had them for 30 years, as you probably know. The Patriot is an autonomous weapon system. But I think it's fair to say that, we know from surveillance that metadata can start the process, but I'm thinking, what I thought I heard is that based on metadata, who you call, that's going to make you a target, that piece of information alone. And
No, I meant the claim was that you're often targeting a SIM phone, right? A SIM card, not meaning that was what determined that this SIM card is what's important.
Too much into it, you do know, right, that they're watching for maybe hundreds of hours before they attack a particular target. I mean, that's part of the problem that we're having keeping drone pilots, because they're sitting there looking at
Okay, did you see
a
what I just
road.
did? I gave him my phone. So
But-
they are looking at my phone for hundreds of hours, right?
But why is there a need to recast some of the killings that happened by operating according to
what
that
I'm
process?
saying is that
because
there are-
what the drone papers show is that, like in the case of human shielding, because fundamentally human shielding and adopting the human shield clause is about recasting civilians by using a different concept.
You're
Why-
assuming
why was
because
that
the
happening?
policy is only to attack senior operational leaders, that anyone else killed was not a lawful target, which is simply not true. If you look at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is not exactly drone-friendly, they will show you that there have been very few non-militants killed in recent years. That's why when you see people talking about drones, they'll say, 22% are civilians, but that's because they're reaching back 5 and 6 years. If you look at the last several years, it's literally a handful. So, I mean, nobody wants any true civilians to be killed, but I'm just suggesting that the targeting process is much more complicated than simply who you may call. There are many other factors. Is a lot of it derived from technical means? Absolutely. Personally, I've always believed that, what people say to each other is more reliable than what some informant may tell you that they said. sort of thing. So I have some confidence in technology. But as Alice points out, it's not perfect. We saw that in Kunduz. And do you remember the Chinese embassy bombing during the Kosovo? The Chinese, I believe, still think that we bombed their embassy on purpose. Because, and it's partly the U.S.'s fault. When you show all this stuff on TV, bombs going in, people start thinking, well, they must be perfect if they want to be. So when something bad happens, then they assume that you deliberately did it. They don't understand that.
Well, in the case
things
of
happen.
signature strikes, I mean, they're talking about personality strikes. If you talk about signature strikes, and they're being done in areas where there are no people on the ground, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, for example, then they're clearly making decisions based on what they see, which is incomplete, isn't it?
And also their analytical skill sets are highly dubious, quite frankly.
Right, I mean, what-
Regarding
there are people
those
who-
How do you know
areas.
that? How do you know they're analytical?
I mean, you know,
I
the
mean-
idea of like people interpreting behavior as a basis upon which what appears to be threatening behavior is, you know, a highly imperfect way. And that's the decision-making basis for targeting. I mean, the targeting of SIM cards is the targeting, but the decision-making is premised, at least in signature strikes, on the skill sets of people. I mean, the CIA, for example, has self-acknowledged that its only success over 40 years was the support of the, you know, Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I mean, we're talking about
What is your
deeply
basis for
limited
saying that their analytical skill sets isn't
to
any good?
interpret what constitutes threatening behavior, all of the like targeting of jirgas and other kinds of things, targeting of wedding parties and so on. These are like based on, you know, a bunch of guys in trucks, you know, carrying guns. I mean, I think that there are significant, it's true, if one actually is going for the personality strikes, you can be, you know, precise on that score. But I mean, the signature strikes are inherently based on not knowing who you're killing and just making judgments on the basis of behavior.
Most of war is based on not knowing who you're killing. When somebody's shooting, do you think that when people are shooting at somebody that they know that they have a little dossier on each person? All they know is somebody's trying to kill me. And I don't know who they are, but I'm going to do something about that person shooting at me.
Let's answer the two others. I'll just say one more remark. I lived for many years in Jerusalem, and every Friday night there was a lot of shooting in the air. And you know what it was? Weddings in the Palestinian villages nearby.
Not that different than what you see in Texas.
And that underlines a problem, a real world problem, because the importance of knowing the culture and the history.
Right, that's what
Because-
that's what Lisa is saying.
Because, you know, when in the U.S., if you shoot at somebody, that's like a bad thing. In other countries, it isn't, as you point out.
Well, they're shooting in the air.
Depends what
But
color it is.
what I'd like to relate very briefly to the two other questions. I disagree a bit about your characterization of Gaza. If you go to Eyal Weizman, the least of possible, Israel decided in advance, the way I understand the 2014, that there were certain neighborhoods that were a mile or 2 miles from the border, and these neighborhoods it would flatten. And that's what it decided, and that's what it did. Anyone that remained, it sent down the leaflets, anyone that remained in those neighborhoods became a human shield after those leaflets were distributed. So that's what your proximity argument is. It could have destroyed much more. It could have made all of Gaza into rubble. And outside this perimeter of these several neighborhoods, both in the north and in the south, that's where this kind of discrimination comes in, and the apparatus of discrimination comes in, where you want to put down a mosque, where you want to put down an apartment building, and so forth. And just regarding, I'm not going to relate directly to it, but we very much see our project of human shielding as a kind of post-colonial analysis. And one of our claims as response to Alice and maybe others is, hey, we suddenly have the universalization of civilianhood following decolonization, okay? And therefore, if we start killing the people that we could kill in the past without being a crime, the colonized, it will be a war crime because they are now civilians. They have states. Which in the past they didn't have states. Now they have states, and we can't just kill them. It will be a war crime. So we need to create a new category. And so we have a new category. And this new category, or part of the reason that we're now seeing this new category of human shield, is we have to create a new category that if you kill it, it's no longer a crime, or it's less of a crime. And so the human shield in many ways replaces the colonized.
John
But
wants
this
to
just
do-
relates to
yeah.
that. But that's not enough, it seems to me, because Alice said that urban warfare presents a new challenge to the West's preferred way of killing, or of warfare. And the historian in me said, Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Hanoi, Berlin. I mean, urban warfare is not a new phenomenon. So the question is, if you are making the post-colonial link, which probably is important to make, what's the difference? And the human shield, you want to argue, is a new way of conceiving of something. What is being conceived of here that the killing of innocent civilians in all of these other moments of warfare didn't require? Right? I mean, there's no human shield vocabulary in response to those, to wiping out those cities. And all that are wiped out are civilians. So if you want to argue that the human shield is a sign of some new way of thinking about warfare, and if there is a post-colonial link, you need to make the other link to this entirely Western form of warfare, which wipes out city after city after city.
What, Chase, and then Van, well, 1 o'clock.
So very fast.
So that,
Let me go very quickly.
yeah.
Neve and Nicola, has IHL taken on the new function of PR, of reassuring domestic constituencies that the war being waged is done properly and in a humane way, even when the numbers may say otherwise? And to what degree is that highly polished IDF video representative of a key function of IHL that is very off the battlefield?
Was someone before? If I could throw something out. I think in the military they think it is part of that. But in the U.S., it's very interesting because the American Red Cross did a survey in 2011, it's still on the web, about people's understanding of IHL. It's appalling. And for example, a goodly number of Americans think it's legal to torture American soldiers who are taken prisoners. That said, the American public, American soldiers, think about that for a while. The American public has such, and this is separate from the consideration of, has such a high opinion of the armed forces. It's the most trusted institution in American society by far.
Really?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yes,
Best.
the competition.
More. No, it's organized religion. It's
Yeah,
small business. It's the Supreme Court. It's institutions like
Yeah,
that.
that's consensus.
And they are confident. I think this is Dunlap's theory. They are so confident that that military is doing everything it can, that when you have something like, remember the drone strike that killed the 2 hostages?
Yeah.
And after that, the Pew research poll was very interesting. Number one, support remained very high. That wasn't the interesting thing. Support is significantly higher based on educational level. In other words, the less educated you are, the more hostile you are to drones. I can't even figure that one out. But I think that there's, in the U.S. situation, they assume that the forces are following the law of war, so they're not as sensitive to this incident or that incident, whatever it may show. But there's a perception that in our allied countries, they are much more sensitive, and that does drive things like, and I think the Israelis, like the films that Niamh was showing, they may be amusing to folks who know a lot about things, but they're trying to address a general public. And what militaries and what militaries would say is
I want to hear the rest of this.
I wanted to ask.
Well, I mean, if you want to answer. Okay, I'll just go ahead. Well, I mean, first of all, I thought this was a really brilliant paper, very chilling as well. You know, when you showed the 4 images of the 4 places and asked us to identify which are the human shields, I mean, obviously, the field of visual perception is already structured such that by simply looking at the location, you guess which ones are the human shields, right? So it made me think that, you know, the common sort of political term, the military-industrial complex, I think what you're doing is to replace that, or at least complement that by a military visual complex that is really at work in contemporary warfare. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I have 2 questions. The first one is, that when you showed the geolocation watch list, I mean, it reminds me of scholars who've written about how aerial bombardments suggest sort of a colonial visuality that renders the targets into objects and dehumanizes in a colonial framework. I wondered if what you're suggesting when you juxtapose that kind of table next to the aerial bombardment with which we're familiar, or the targeting, are you suggesting that this is a new threshold that is being crossed in terms of visuality, in terms of the way in which the target is represented? And what does that mean in relation to the geopolitical dynamics involved between the targeter and the targeted? And then the second question is, what is the relationship between this visuality or visibility and publicity? I think different people were getting at that, but I really want to hear your response to how these two work together, or sometimes maybe at cross purposes with one another.
Let's start, because Barbara wants, so you answer.
To go to the first question, is it domestic or not? I don't know. I think that the challenge is precisely to intervene in the reshaping of international humanitarian law, much more than really producing consent at home, in a way, in domestic context. I don't think that Israel needs human shields at home in order to legitimize or keep the consent high, especially given the long historical trend of representation of Palestinians in a certain way. So I think that the objective is clearly to have a say on international humanitarian law and to shape it.
Why wouldn't they be concerned about other countries' perception of them, since they depend so highly on the other countries?
Yes, that's why it's in English.
So,
When the Goldstone came to do, the Goldstone Commission was created, Israel immediately said it's not willing to talk with Goldstone. At the same time, it wrote a 250 pages, maybe you've read it, a defense of caste lead and submitted it to Goldstone. Okay, this is a lot of these. So this is into your intervention during the talk. A lot. I think it's a legal defense on the one hand. 2, I think it's a PR in the sense of I'm going to give tools to Israel's supporters how they need to answer the data that shows that 70% of those killed are civilians. This is a way of answering that. And you can see it much more in the infographics that we didn't get to. So there's these kind of two, and what happens, what we show in another paper, is that these infographics go to cartoons in mainstream press in South Bend, Indiana, and in Minneapolis, and everywhere, this whole human shields, it's full, thousands. Just do human shields cartoons on Google Images, you'll see thousands. So there's this kind of how this discourse becomes popularized in the mainstream.
It's a publicity and a popularization.
Isn't it the analog of what governments are seeing, like ISIS doing, and the way that they are very effectively using media, social media and so forth? I think governments are looking at that and thinking, look at the success that ISIS, that our adversaries have, so we need to get into this space. And militaries have this idea that, well, if we show them what we're doing, then all the criticism will go away. And it's a false hope, because people are more concerned, I think, about the fundamental issue of should we be attacking Gaza at all, as opposed to the mechanics of it. And I think that it's ultimately not that persuasive. Although, remember what Goldstone did. He ended up writing the op-ed where he said he was sorry for what he did, if he had known. But then I think Israel, and part of this, is now in a conundrum.
After he wasn't invited to his grandson's
Yeah,
mitzvah,
exactly.
right?
That was a self-serving.
But I think that's really a conundrum. Is it better to participate in these things, even if they are going to be slanted against them from the root, or do you try to do it independently like this? And I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
We have to stop, sorry.
Yeah.
Lunch is